Welcome to our webinar on moving to Portugal, looking at the practicalities of that move. This is part of our Retire Abroad Virtual Roadshow webinar series, and today we aim to give you an idea of some of the issues that you should consider as you plan your retirement to Portugal. Most of what we cover will, however, be relevant to whatever reason you are planning to move to Portugal. We'll be following this with a session on buying property in Portugal, and then this afternoon on the financial issues to be considered. And in this webinar, we'll be looking at issues like immigration, residence, healthcare, banking, and a number of other items. So I'm Nigel Ayres. I run Expat Network. I've lived in Hong Kong, Malaysia, the US, and for the last 3.5 years in Spain. We're joined by Luis da Silva, who runs Algarve Senior Living, Property Finders Portugal, and a number of other brands. Before we start, I'd just like you to sort of note that we're here to answer your questions. So if you have any, please use the button on your screen, and we'll answer any that we can during the webinar. Any that we can't, we'll follow up we'll follow up by email. Okay. So if you have any questions after the event, or you want a referral to one of our network of people that help us help people move abroad, then just contact us at expats@expatnetwork.com. And so perhaps if we could start, Luis, by with you introducing yourself and explaining the services that you provide.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nigel, and welcome everyone. Good morning to those listening in. My name is Luis da Silva. So I've lived, bit of background like Nigel, I've lived in 10 countries around the world, across 4 continents, and worked in a number of others. I used to be, before I did this and set up this business, I used to work in the corporate world, sort of management consulting and technology firms, and used to run a number of those international operations for different companies. So that took me and traveled around the world. So actually the basis for the business when we created it was because we saw the challenges that people faced when moving to a new country. That and a number of other factors. So we set up the business around a decade ago, and essentially it is set up to assist people from different places in the world move to, retire to, or invest in Iberia. Our main market is Portugal, although we do some work in Spain as well, but main market is Portugal, and the focus of our business is primarily on the pre-retiree and the retiree market. Although increasingly we have been working with families and more recently with digital nomads because of a number of visas that are being created. Our business model is very much in engaging with people early on in the process, and we help them with everything from sort of working out whether Portugal in this case is the right option for them, which areas within Portugal is the right. We then help them with sort of setting up the entire process of applying for their visa and making introductions to the relevant sort of experts in that area, the accommodation element, and then helping people settle in. So if you consider us as a business, we're quite broad based, but as we've grown, we haven't been able to continue to tackle everything ourselves. So we have a huge network of specialist partners in country that help you with sort of opening a bank account, getting your fiscal number, and things like that, which we don't necessarily do ourselves. So consider us a sort of one-stop shop to help you sort of make the transition to Portugal. You're muted.
I must remember to do this every time. Okay. Many people will have decided on the precise area that they want to move to, but in the registration information, it's clear that some people have marked multiple destinations in Portugal. Indeed, some of them have marked Portugal amongst a number of other countries, and therefore, haven't yet decided that Portugal is a destination for them. So, could you just give us an overview of the sort of attractions of moving to Portugal, and also what the different areas of Portugal are and their various attractions? Just in
Sure. So I think at the moment, if we look at the reasons that people cite for choosing Portugal, in addition to knowing the country. So there is a group of people, especially from the UK, who have visited Portugal for a number of years, just like there are a number of people who visited Spain or visited France for a number of years. And so that's usually, especially if you're looking at a UK audience, that usually tends to be a factor for a decision for considering Portugal. So they know the country to some degree. That's different. We work with 30 nationalities, more or less, last count. And that's different to certain other nationalities like the Canadian, American, South African, and so on, where the knowledge of the country is not necessarily that great. So if we set aside that point, a couple of things that stand out in Portugal, the first, the three or four, the lower cost of living generally. There are some exceptions, but the general lower cost of living, the friendliness of the people. A lot of people mention the fact that the Portuguese stand out as being much friendlier than other Southern European nations, and combine that with the fact that they speak English very well. That means that communication can flow quite easily with foreign people who arrive. And then the most practical reason cited is the ease with which one can obtain a residency visa. So the residency visa program in Portugal is, at the moment, one never knows how this changes, but it's ranked probably as the best in the world, even beating the Panama friendly family visa, which has undergone some changes in recent years for those who keep up with this. So Portugal is now the standout candidate for friendly visas, and the reason for that is because the thresholds, the financial thresholds to get in are quite low. There's a bit of paperwork, as it is with everything, but it's quite a fast visa, between 60 to 90 days to actually receive it, and it can be based on a rental or the purchase of a property. So you have flexibility about how to get in the country and how to live. In terms of the areas of the country, a big factor for many people is still the fact that they don't necessarily speak Portuguese, and therefore they want to be in an area where some English is spoken. And in the main, that means that the coastal areas of Portugal tend to come to the fore, because most of the expat communities are along the coastline, as indeed are most of the larger Portuguese communities. Portugal has had a sort of migratory movement from inland to the coast. And so when we compare the areas, it's not that we're not sort of don't love the inland or whatever, but when we talk about the areas, we tend to talk about coastal areas because that's what most people who are moving to the country look for, with one or two exceptions. And then there are three or four standout areas. The Algarve is always the number one area because it's well known as a tourist destination, but it's also a place where a lot of people have settled, expats have settled, because there are existing sort of pockets of expats of different nationalities, and you go there for the weather and a number of other things which I'll cover in my presentation. The Greater Lisbon area, accessibility, it's the capital of the country, and therefore lots of people go there because it's easy to get in and out, especially intercontinental flights tend to come to Lisbon. Transportation is fantastic, lots of things to do culturally and so on. We then have the Silver Coast, which is initially was considered sort of a cheaper version of the Algarve, and people used to go there because they used to get coastline, not as good weather, admittedly, but they used to get sort of coastal property cheaper. That's no longer the case necessarily. Prices have gone up tremendously there, so that benefit is to a large degree disappeared on coastal property. And then Porto has emerged over the last 5-6 years as a destination, cultural destination, that a lot of people aspire to, as long as you don't mind sort of long periods of grey and rainy weather in the winter. So that is a factor.
Okay, and I think one of the factors that has traditionally drawn people to Portugal is the non-habitual resident scheme, which gives that sort of 10-year tax advantage, and we'll be covering that in the financial planning session this afternoon. But what's interesting, I think, is the point you make about people on lower income, and that because of the entry level financial requirements, it's much lower than Spain, and that means that somebody on basic pension and not much more can afford to go there and enjoy the sunshine, which is now difficult for that sort of level of income in Spain.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely correct. And I think what happens is, as long as you're aware of the fact that the accommodation element has got a lot more expensive the last decade or so. So you just need to plan that. But in terms of getting in and qualifying, you're absolutely right. It is one of the most affordable visas, even when you compare to Thailand, where the rules are changing and so on, and it's right here in Europe on the doorstep. So it's a very practical option at the moment. And you're perfectly right. Combine it with the NHR, which for many sources of income, especially pension income, occupational pensions and so on, is on a low basis, 10% and tax on that. So it's a low base of tax as well, which means saving money.
Okay. Yeah, so let's sort of start off by going through a few of the things that people should consider as they plan their retirement abroad. I guess the first thing is, how do you sort of finance it? And I'm not planning to go into detail on that, but many people will be financing it through private and state pensions, and we'll deal with the private pension side this afternoon. But in terms of the state pension, I'll just quickly give a little background to that. If you already have a pension and are receiving your pension, then it's reasonably straightforward. You can continue to receive it in the UK and then have it transferred through your own bank arrangements, or you can have it paid over to this country. If you reach retirement age, state pension age, while you're abroad, then you need to apply to the International Pension Department, and that I can speak from personal experience, can be an interesting process. The first thing is, if you download the form that is on the form, they ask you questions like, have you ever lived in the UK? Give details of everywhere you've ever lived in the UK, give details of everybody who've ever employed in the UK, all of which they do not ask if you were happening to, if you lived all your life in England and apply there, or the UK, sorry. So the other option is to pick up the phone. There's a phone number. It's on our website. It's on, available on government websites. But if you do that, they just ask you a relatively small number of questions. You go through that. They then put you in the system, and it follows through. Now, my own personal experience is it didn't quite work like that, because 3 months later I hadn't heard anything. So I picked up the phone again, and 1 week they said, sorry, nothing has happened to your application. I don't know why. We'll put you on the urgent list. And 1 week later it was all sorted. So the primary thing, if you're looking at your state pension, is pick up the phone and speak to them. It's much more efficient than trying to fill in the very complex forms that they ask you to fill. So the other side of it is obviously property. And again, we've got the session next about buying property. But one of the key things we need to decide is whether you're going to rent or buy in Spain, and what you're going to do with your UK property. So, Lewis, I mean, in terms of renting and buying, is it easy to rent in Portugal? What's your advice on that?
I wanted to also make a point about the updating of pension amounts in Europe. So Europe has the advantage that the UK pension, if you are retired overseas, your UK pension, if you live in Europe, will track the increases in the UK. So some countries overseas will not. There's a list that the UK government publishes, but anything in the European Union will. So you will keep getting your pension updates. In terms of a rent versus buy, it's much tougher for a whole range of reasons, which I won't go into now, but it's much tougher to rent than it was a few years ago. And finding rentals is not easy in the popular places. Okay, so advanced planning is absolutely essential. Okay, we actually in the Algarve, because again, for a whole number of reasons which I won't describe now, but we set up a portfolio of more than 300 properties in the Algarve for sort of medium long-term rental, of which I think just over 100 are actually full long-year rental, and they're almost always full because we're planning in advance and we're helping people find places and find their accommodation well in advance. So the key thing about all this is that there is a timing, and so timing is essential. It's not that easy to find suitable accommodation, well-priced accommodation, and so on. So you need to work with someone who can help you find this accommodation well in advance. Buying is easier, even though the last few years there's been a lack of inventory with the number of people arriving, and so there's been a huge drop in the supply, between a third and 40% drop in listings, actually, due to the amount absorbed by the end market. So Portugal is not a place where there's a sort of huge amount of supply. There'll be you take a snapshot of the market, and then that inventory will not change much for a while. So the key message I want to get across is easy to do conceptually, so no limitations in terms of what you can rent as long as it's available, and what you can buy as a foreign, initially a foreign resident, but you must plan well in advance. Otherwise, you will find yourself scrabbling around for something, and potentially, especially if you're renting, paying a premium if you get the timing wrong.
Right. Okay. I guess the other side of financing your retirement there is the cost of living, and you've already said that is lower than the UK. Could you sort of give us a bit more of a flavour of the sort of the costs that people can expect?
Sure. So generally speaking, around 30% low, I would say still, despite, it's so difficult at the moment because in every country, prices are going up all the time. Literally in some shops, you're seeing a price difference in bread or whatever every week almost. So it's difficult. You listening will recognize this challenge as much as we do. But generally speaking, you can still save. And I'll point out a few areas where Portugal is a lot cheaper, and some areas, sort of buyer beware areas. So staples such as bread, and then fish, certain types of meat, not beef, but certainly pork, chicken. These are much cheaper than in the UK. Okay, so and in other sort of countries like the US and so on, you can find a whole range, especially fish. If you're a fish eater, most shops, unlike the UK where there's not much variety of fish, but most shops will have a wet fish counter, very fresh fish, and you just need to scan your eye over the prices of the fish and pick out the ones that are cheaper on the day, and you will be able to eat a variety of fish. So healthy eating, if you will, is a lot easier in a place like Portugal than it is in the UK. You don't need to have as much pre-processed food. You can have fresh food. The vegetables are in the main very cheap, and again, you have access to markets, and sometimes they're cheaper, sometimes they're expensive, to be fair. So you just shop around. So a key trick we always tell people is to shop around. You kind of do a weekly milk run, and you look at the specials of each of the shops, and there are 5 or 6 large chains of stores, shall we say, grocery stores that exist in the country, and you go to each one of them and you buy what's on special if you need to, and you will save yourself a packet of money from doing that. It's a bit like using the I always use this example, the sort of close to sell by date at Asda in the UK type of thing. They have that 3 times a day. And if you time your shopping right, you can actually save a ton of money on food that is perfectly vegetables, fresh food, whatever, that is perfectly good to eat, and you can drop your cost there. So the food and the basic transportation is very cheap, much cheaper than the UK, and if you are retired over 65 usually, then you get further discounts and exemptions. So that's a really area of low cost. Health is a bit like, if you're mainly from the UK listening to this presentation, it's like the NHS, free at the point of delivery. And actually we can't understand it, because we've been having the same debate in Portugal as the NHS in the UK. How sustainable is the funding model for the health system? But they've actually abolished the co-payment rates on GP and other appointments, which we can't understand, because it was a €5 cost, which most people could have afforded, and they've abolished that. So again, free at the point of delivery, and the system works pretty much in the same way and with the same problems as the NHS. Delays, sometimes at GPs, difficulty with finding, but cheap and effective. Okay, then the things you need to look out for are that are expensive. Electricity is expensive, we used to say, but it actually has not gone up in the same way that it has, for example, in the UK. UK has gone up by 300-400% with a cap. It hasn't happened in Portugal. So actually, your electricity is now not as expensive as the UK, strangely enough. But cars are expensive, and accommodation is the other aspect that can be quite expensive and needs to be you need to look at with care.
Okay, and I guess much like my experience in Spain, eating out is more common, is it not, in Portugal than people would be used to in the UK?
It's interesting. It's more common among people who move there than the Portuguese themselves, because the Portuguese still find it rather expensive because they have very low salaries relative to the average. But what I would say in comparison to Spain, and we find this ourselves, is that sort of you go out for a cheap and simple meal, which Portugal is great at. Portugal is good at the sort of not overly complicated meal, very tasty, but quite simple environment. And that is cheap as chips. It really is. You can get those meals day in, day out for under 10 euros a person easily. Okay, you can't get that in Spain anymore. Where Spain comes into its own, and we do this comparison all the time because I spend a lot of time in both countries. If you go for more sophisticated meals, the price of sophisticated meals in Spain is actually very reasonable. It's expensive, but it's very reasonable. Whereas in Portugal, it tends to become quite expensive. So what you want to do is, if you want to go for a fancy meal, you do so in Spain. But if you want to go for a simple meal, you do so in Portugal.
Right. Okay. The other thing that people sort of, contemplating retiring abroad is, how easy is it to settle in, and what sort of advice would you give to people to sort of really, settle into the lifestyle, build a network of friends and so on, to replace what is, for most people, they've spent decades building up a network of friends in the UK.
Yeah, I think I would actually just start this answer by saying that COVID has changed a lot of things, including making the UK a lot more isolated and insular. Communities have literally been sort of indoor for a while, and with the natural hesitation of most people, in the UK, we still haven't gone sort of fully back to that sort of mass socialization that existed before. So I think people are a little bit more open-minded about this moving thing, because they feel that it might be a new experience of making new friends. And that's exactly what happened. I'll give you the example I give a lot of people. One of our first clients was a Swedish couple. They speak actually pretty good English, but they were very nervous. This was maybe 10 years ago or something. They were very nervous when they moved, and they fell in love with Portugal. We actually were looking for a rental for them, and we landed up selling them a house because they so loved the place. And normally it's the other way around, but they just loved it. It was right for them, and they're forever grateful. And the biggest fear was, Agneta, the wife, was saying to us was, I'm really worried that we will not make friends here. And I said, well, you've chosen a community where there are other Swedes. Give it time, but you've got to have a few interests. And their interest was golf. That was their main interest. So they signed up to a local club. A year later, I kid you not, Nigel, a year later, I spoke to Rolf and Agneta, and I mean, I spoke to them various times, but a year later, I remember the conversation. They said to me, you know what? We have been so blessed, because through the golf, primarily, we have made many friends, and those friends have other interests that they share with us. So they love photography, they love traveling. They had 4 groups of friends that they used to travel throughout Portugal with, and they said, it's a year later, we are full up. We cannot take on any more new friendships because we've just made so many new friends. And the key thing, the message, is that you need to find the group or the activities that you enjoy doing, and join sort of groups or clubs or associations or whatever in that do that, whether it be golf, walking, hiking or whatever. And the other thing is that it came up in the other presentation is that you probably will not know the language, but the local municipalities actually run language courses mainly for expats, and they're free most of the time. And so if you go to those and you do sort of language courses, you will meet other expats that are learning the language, and you will make friendships as well. So those are a couple of ideas for those of you who don't have children. If you have children, it's really easy. You will make a lot of friends with parents of other children at schools if you're moving with kids.
Yeah, and our own experience when we moved to Spain, which is obviously very similar, we didn't, our children have grown up, but we met friends both through the office I worked in, which was a co-working office, and through them ended up with a large group of friends who are much younger than us, in fact, who have children and so on, but also, common interests, if you like. In this case, drinking out in bars, but that's another matter. I guess the other thing then is taking your goods across, and obviously being in Europe, it's relatively straightforward, more than a long haul international move. For most people, if you're going to take the stuff, the question is, how much do you take? If you're leaving your house sort of unfurnished, or you're selling your house, then generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of stuff to take over. Bear in mind that a Southern European house or villa or apartment may be a very different lifestyle and a very different size of property and so on. So not everything is suitable. And so be careful, don't take things if it's not worth it. It's better to dispose and buy new. But one of the things that I've learned from bitter experience is you can get a man in a van, and if that will take it, sometimes 2 vans or more. But one of the things to bear in mind is weight is an issue with the Lutons. So they take away these Lutons, generally driven by Eastern European drivers and so on. And the issue is always that you can fit the things in the Luton, but you can't necessarily take it because it takes it over the weight. Whereas if you have a removal company, they've got big trucks and they don't have those same restrictions. But just a quick point on that. I don't know whether there's anything. The other thing is, of course, that with Brexit, a lot of things you need to fill in the forms and so on to avoid having to pay duty and VAT, and so that is more complicated than it used to be. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, 3 quick points. Exactly as Nigel has said, make sure you do a bill of lading and declare the items. You have a maximum time on the assumption that you're going to move over permanently with a visa of sorts. You have a maximum time, typically within 12 months, to which to import in Portugal. During which to import those goods duty-free, okay? And pretty much as long as you're declaring them as a list of items you already own, you should not have any issue with that or have to pay any fees or taxes on that. Standout thing is cars. Really do think twice and 3 times and 4 times about whether or not you want to take a vehicle over, not only because the steering wheel is on the wrong side, but also because it is one of the most complicated things to import, even if it is and you are entitled to it. If you are set on taking a car, you're only entitled to 1 car per person. Or 1 vehicle, I should say, motorized vehicle. I'm not sure exactly now. It'll be either sort of a motorbike or a car. You can't have both. Duty free. You can take as many as you like if you pay the duty, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's huge. And you've got to have owned it for at least 6 months before you actually import it. Okay, it's got to have been in your name in the country of origin for 6 months. So that's a trick that sometimes people miss. And then with pets, you've got to make sure that they are fully vaccinated and the vaccinations are all up to date. So you may want to use a specialized pet company because they have to deal with the general veterinary department in Portugal to make sure that the vaccinations and everything else are up to date. And some pets do require quarantine. Some breeds of animal do require quarantine compulsorily. So you want to make sure that your pets are in, have the best experience possible as they transition. So, but you can communicate communicate by email with these people, so it's not too difficult.
Okay, many thanks. It's useful points there. So let's move on to the formalities of immigration and visas. I'll start off by saying for those of you who are planning only to spend part of your time in Portugal, then after the exit from the EU, British citizens are subject to the Schengen rules. Now, the Schengen, they don't have to apply for a visa, but you are subject to those rules. And that is that you can only spend 90 and 180 days in the country if you don't have a visa. Now, that is not just in Portugal, but in the whole of the EU. So any time spent in there is 90 and 100 days, 80 days. Many people get a little confused as to how this works, but the easiest way to think of it is look at today, look back 180 days, and if you, sorry, just one second. Sorry, my camera seems to be messing about. If you, right, I'm back with you. So if you, so you look back 180 days, if you have been for more than 90 days in that 180 days, then you would be in breach. There has traditionally not been a lot of attention to that, but there are new regulations on biometric testing and other things which will mean that they'll be they're likely to be a lot more vigorous. What's the experience in Portugal, Lewis? Have people been falling foul of those the Schengen rules? And
If they've been falling foul, the sense I get, I mean, luckily we talk to our clients about this all the time, so we don't have any clients that are kind of anywhere close to a breach. But the general chatter that I'm picking up on social media and so on is that there are a couple of people who sort of haven't got it. They haven't understood the 90, 180-day rule. And then they're sort of desperately asking about this and how can I extend my stay? And then you get the usual Facebook comments, you know, some helpful, some not so helpful about that. But they are certainly paying attention. So the Borders Agency is certainly paying attention to this. And in the future, this has been rolled out to November now, I believe. We're going to have an ETIAS system, which is an external border control with biometrics and pre-declaration of stays. And you're going to have to sort of fill this in a bit like we do in the US, or the ESTA declarations in the US, which are valid for 3 years. So you have to pretty much declare your entire life on this form and take a photograph and whatever. That's going to happen in Europe. So I think there's going to be really little option but to be compliant if you do not have a visa.
Yeah. Now, certainly in Spain, if you apply for a visa and you have breached those rules, you will be disqualified from being able to apply. It's the same in Portugal.
I would imagine so. Yes, I don't actually know of any person, as I say, cases, and we've dealt with hundreds of clients, but no one's been non-compliant for that reason. Maybe funnily enough, but I would imagine so. Yes, it will be a disqualifying factor. Yeah.
So a risk not probably worth taking.
No.
So assuming you're planning to stay longer term in Portugal, full time, then you need to get a visa. We're talking here about retirement, and so the real options are a D7 or passive income visa or the golden visa. The golden visa is very much more about allowing you the flexibility to go to Portugal and indeed access the EU on a part-time basis. If you are going to be going there full time, then effectively the D7 will give you all of the benefits you need, but it does require you to become fully resident. So could you perhaps outline the terms of the D7? What do people need to do and what are the rules and so on?
Yeah. Okay, so D7 is as you've explained very well, is much more intended for those people who actually want to settle in the country. And the advantage over the golden visa are twofold. Firstly, it allows for both rentals and the purchase of a property in terms of your accommodation. That's one major difference. And the second, it has no limitations in terms of regions. Those of you may have heard, some of you may have heard that the golden visa now has some limits, exclusions on residential property in the high density areas, which are the most popular coastal areas, the D7 does not have any such limitations. It applies equally anywhere in the country. So the D7 is basically about gathering paperwork. It is really about that. A couple of key things you need to prove: that you have no criminal history. So if you're coming from the UK, an ACRO certificate, that you have sufficient passive income, which is broadly speaking double the minimum wage, so call it about 1,400 euros a month. You have to deposit into an account an initial amount into your own account. I should emphasize your money, and you will hear different people saying different things about this amount. There's something legislated, but typically we say around 12,000, is enough for a sort of a person, a little bit more for anyone else. And that's something you do once, and then it's your money. You use it as you wish. I've talked about the passive income, and then there's a number of little bits of information you have to put together. You have to get a fiscal number called a NIF, and that can be done remotely. There are a number of companies now doing it remotely. Or if you're buying a property, for example, then your lawyer will go and get your NIF as well as part of their package. You need to open a bank account. And again, there are ways of opening a bank account remotely or with a simple visit to a UK branch of a Portuguese bank, for example. So that's also possible. You then need to find your accommodation. It tends to be the most tricky thing. And if you're coming from the UK, you can take a trip out to sort of double check the area, or even maybe look at a property, although that doesn't always work that well. If you're coming from further away, then it's perfectly possible to take a decision at a distance if you work with someone who can actually do a virtual visit or something like that. We then always recommend that you set up a Forex account. This is not a legal requirement, but it's a practical requirement we suggest, because you will be moving money between different currencies. And what you do not want to do is use your bank. It will be expensive and you will lose money in doing so. And then you have to package all these things up, book yourself an appointment. If you're coming in the UK, from the UK, either in London or Manchester, and you have to book an appointment, one of those two consulates. You have to present all this information to the consulate. That will then give you, they will take that all away. It will take usually between 60 to 90 days for them to approve the visa, as long as you've met all the criteria. And then they will call you in. They will stamp your passport with a 120-day temporary visa. And during that period, you will be required to go and have your entry interview with the borders agency in Portugal called CEF. Okay, and you'll basically show most or a subset of the stuff you've already shown the consulate, again, including, very importantly, your rental contract or the deeds of your property if you've bought one. And then they will stamp the first visa in your passport, valid for 2 years, and then you'll renew that every couple of years until you're at 5 years. So that's the sort of simplified overview. It's more, a lot of people are doing this by themselves with some help from companies like us in terms of making relevant introductions to sort of get your fiscal number, getting a bank account and so on. You do not, just to make it clear, you do not need, a huge and expensive advisor or lawyer to do that. Where you should be using a lawyer is for validating and checking your contract, and for doing conveyancing if you're buying a property. That's a good and efficient use of a law firm, for example. This is not complex enough, although, a lot of people are making a lot of money. I'm not talking just about lawyers. There's a whole range of companies that have sprung up, charging thousands of euros per D7 application. Respectfully, I think it's just a waste of money. You can save that money by sort of doing a lot of it yourself if you've got a bit of structure and are patient.
Okay. And what about healthcare? Are you required to have private healthcare or
Yep. Yeah, so what you're required to do in terms of the application is you're required to have a travel policy, which must, so it must include repatriation during that period, just in case you get ill during the 120 days that you're sort of in the country. Okay, what we recommend to people is the following two things. Firstly, and we can make some suggestions. There's some online sort of Allianz policies and others that can be done online, and they're visa compliant and they're very reasonably priced. So we'll make we'll point you in the right direction. Again, what we recommend to people is to take out a year-long policy, and the reason for this is that possibly with the ability to cancel or get a bit of a refund. And the reason for this is that the meetings with the borders agency are often delayed. So you will not be illegal in Portugal because the government allows, if it's their delay, they extend automatically your 120 days. But the problem is if you fall ill and your policy then lapses, then your options of getting an extension or a new policy in country are very limited. So take out an insurance policy, which is a travel policy with full repatriation, okay, and no co-payments. They don't want, they want basically a clean policy that allows you to be repatriated to your home country if you have a sort of major medical problem without loading the health system. Once you are then in country, then you have two options. You then have the right to use the national health system, which is a residency-based system, much like the UK is. Okay, we've talked about this actually prior to the conversation. But you have to sign up at your local parish and get your local kind of equivalent to the NHS number and so on in the local system, okay, the social security number, and that may take a bit of time. So what sometimes people do is they move from a travel policy to a local private insurance policy for a period of time, okay? During that transition, can be a few months or the first year to be safe, and then they'll have access to the national health system, and then they can decide to keep the private policy using Portugal as a base, because they typically are not that expensive, although in the UK people are accustomed to free NHS, and therefore it will be more expensive than the UK, but a lot less expensive than if you're coming from the US, for example, about 1/10 of the cost, probably, or you can just use the national health system in Portugal.
Right. And once we're on healthcare, an S1 obviously entitles you to basically have healthcare in the EU paid for by the government. Is that relevant if the healthcare is free anyway in Portugal?
It is relevant because you have to then register that S1. In fact, I'm not getting a blank now on the exact timing. You don't need to register, as in Spain you have to register the S1 prior to the visa application. This is not the case in Portugal. You don't have to register pre a visa. You just have to get the insurance policy, which is what they want. They don't want the S1, they want the insurance policy first, okay, even if you're entitled to an S1. You then register the S1 later, and it is relevant because within the EU inter and EU laws, it is relevant in terms of the determination of who is responsible for paying your healthcare, depending on which system you've contributed most towards in terms of your social security, or in the case of the UK, national insurance payment. So it is relevant. So you will then have to go and present your S1 later, yes, but it does not change, as it does in Spain, does not change your application process, which still requires the temporary insurance.
Okay, so then the other option is the golden visa for people who are not going to be working in Portugal. It's obviously less relevant for most people, but could you give us a quick outline on how the golden visa works?
Yeah, so golden visa is very simple. It's actually used for most people who want access to the residency in Portugal, and therefore the rights that come with residency, such as free travel into the EU and the possibility of citizenship after 5 years, okay? But for people who don't necessarily want to spend the time in Portugal, because again, as far as the golden visa program is concerned, it is one of the most generous in terms of amount of time required to be spent, which is on average 1 week a year, okay, in country. Panama, for example, is lower. You only have sort of once every 5 years or whatever it is, I can't remember, once every 3 years. But Portugal, broadly speaking, is one of the most generous because very little time required. So for those people who are still working, not retired, or who just want the access to the European residency but are still living in another country, this is a good option. However, if you are thinking of later living in Portugal, and if you, like many other or the majority of other foreign people, intend to live along the coast, then the golden visa is no longer a good option, because many of the coastal areas have been excluded from the golden visa program because residential product, so only residential product, is in high density areas, most of which are along the coast, are no longer eligible for golden visa status. So that means if you want to live, or you want to buy a property in which you will live, that is in a high density area like Lisbon, most of the Algarve, Porto, most of the Silver Coast, a property in which you can live will not qualify for the golden visa. Only commercial property or touristic property, which means you can't live in it because it's made available to the tourist market. So please be aware of this. This has become the biggest, with the change happened in the beginning of 2022, and this is the biggest change to the system, which many people have not yet understood. If you want to live in Portugal within the next 5 years, think carefully, because the golden visa is unlikely to be a good option for you.
Right. Okay. And okay, so let's move on then to driving in Portugal. Firstly, can you? We've covered already the importation of cars, but can you drive on your UK license, or do you have to get a?
Yeah, this is a bit of an anomaly in my view. I don't know why, but so if you're not resident in Portugal, as far as I can recall, you can actually drive on a UK license for up to 6 months in the country without doing anything special. If you are resident, you have 90 days within which to actually exchange your license for a Portuguese license, based on the fact that you have your residency. So you've got to change your address, okay, and then drive. So if you are resident, you cannot exceed those 90-day that 90-day period by driving on a UK license or any other. Let's talk the UK, because it's slightly different for a few other markets, but the UK, you will be in breach, okay. And in Portugal, in terms of your age, you do have to do a few additional tests, mainly eyesight tests from certain ages. So from 50 onwards, you have to do, I think at 50 it's self-declaration, but from 60 you have to actually do a test, and your doctor, your GP, has to go and then log on to the IMTT system, okay, which is the sort of the equivalent of the DVLA, and report that you have passed your eyesight test and so on. And so it's not only a combination of having a valid driver license, but also having a valid eyesight test, and you need to have both of these to then get your license validated. So it's one of the first things you should start looking at when you arrive in country, is talk to a specialist that can help you convert your driver's license. You will need to obviously have your home address. That's absolutely crucial, and make sure that you have your residency stamp, the visa stamp. But so that's the answer. You can drive, but you will need to convert your license.
Right. Okay. Banking. How easy is it to open a bank account in Portugal, and can you open them before you get there?
Yeah, the answer is very easy. Haven't known anyone with issues in opening a bank account, strangely enough. It's a bit bureaucratic, actually, at times, some paperwork and so on, but it's very easy. Things you normally need are your copy of your passport, you know, a telephone number. Oops, excuse me, I'm getting a bit like you yesterday, getting somebody to try to call us here. So a copy of your passport, telephone number. Sometimes you have to make a small deposit, 100, 250 euros or whatever, just to open an account. And it is possible to do this remotely. Okay. Some banks have the possibility of doing the KYC, so that's know your customer or client remotely. So you will send them all the information, and then they will do a Zoom or similar call with you to vet and to validate. You kind of hold up your passport next to your face to see that it's you, and they'll validate you. Others will be, for example, ask you to send all the paperwork and then to attend their UK branch, a UK branch of the bank, just for final validation. And others will do everything remotely and then require you to, in country, in Portugal, just sign off on the account, when during one of your visits. So we have banks that work in different ways. And again, we have different banks. We even have banks with no fees, which these days I know it's very common in the UK not to have a fee on your account, but it's not that common in Portugal. In Portugal, the majority of banks charge you a monthly fee for holding money there. And then they charge you a fee for your debit card, and a fee for your credit card and whatever. Sometimes that's waived if you do other bits and bobs with them in the bank. But so there are some banks that now don't have fees involved.
Okay, and the online banks like Revolut and so on, are they increasingly popular in Portugal?
They are. So not only Revolut and N26 and whatever, but also a payment mechanism such as MBWay, which is a kind of like a debit card linked to an account and so on, where you can pay using that. I would say that they are not as popular in terms of everyday use among local people. In other words, you wouldn't use a Revolut card necessarily unless you're kind of a young person that insists on using Revolut, than you would your multibanco or your debit card, for example. But where we have seen an increase in this is for foreign people who are spending time in the UK, not necessarily on a residence basis, but on a non-resident basis, and they held multiple currencies on their, let's say, Revolut cards. Then they can use that card because they've already done all the currency. But it's a bit like using one of the Forex cards. Some of the Forex companies also come with a card, and you have a multiple currencies there. You've done all your multiple currency Forex trading already at the rate that you chose, and you then have balances in each currency sitting there, and you can use that to sort of pay for local goods. But generally speaking, yes, it's grown is the answer, but it's still not, a major part of the economy. The major thing is using sort of a debit card for payments.
Okay, just a quick sugar one here. Got a question. How good is the internet in Portugal, and is it expensive?
Yeah, a very good and not that expensive, I feel. So a few years ago, we used to have this sort of situation. When I say a few years, I mean maybe 10 years ago, we had sort of the odd black spot, behind a hill or whatever, where you couldn't get a repeater station. That doesn't exist generally anymore. The only thing that you will find is that coverage is very good, 98, 7, 8, 9% or whatever covers the territory, so very good coverage. Upload and download speeds are pretty good, especially in the main cities where there's fiber pretty much everywhere. If you're out in more rural areas, it will depend on the distance to your closest sort of repeater station, if you will. So fairly reliable. If you're remote, maybe this upload and download speeds will not be that quick. So if you're an online trader and need to trade quickly, don't go and live in the middle of the countryside is the message. And the average package, basic package, which will bundle some television stations and one mobile and whatever, will cost you maybe 30 to 40 euros a month.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. I think we'll call it a day there. And I'd just like to finish off by thanking everybody for listening. I know some of you are planning to make the move in the near future, but some are planning well in advance indeed. as I have mentioned before. The longest one is 2030, so they're definitely thinking, planning in advance. As I've already said, we're here to help you. And if you have any questions or you want a referral to any of the service providers we have a network of carefully chosen, then just contact us on expats@expatnetwork.com. If you want to contact Lewis, you can do so direct, or you can again sort of come to me and I'll pass it on to Lewis. And so, Lewis, what's the best way to contact you?
Oh, I was going to say, I got so many emails. The info@algarveseniorliving.com probably is the one, or info@propertyfinderportugal.com. Either of those work, or just on one of our websites. Just through there, it'll get through to one of the team members.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lewis. Thank you for everyone for listening, and we'll call it a day there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.